In the long, brutal history of human conflict, most decisions, however momentous, have contained their destruction within a defined geography, a particular generation. But in the closing days of the Second World War, humanity crossed a threshold. We unlocked a power that defied all previous limits, a power that transformed war from a terrible contest of nations into a potential sentence of extinction for the entire human species. This is the story of that transition. It is the story of the scientific race, the political calculations, and the split-second military judgment that brought us to the very brink. It is the story of a single cascading series of events in October 1962, a 13-day period where the world held its breath, where the routine protocol of a Soviet submarine captain converged with the rigid war plans of two superpowers, and where one man's decision averted a chain reaction that could have ended life as we know it. This is the story of the war decision that almost destroyed the planet. The genesis of this new era of peril did not begin in a political cabinet, but in a laboratory. The 1930s were a golden age of physics, but the discovery of nuclear fission in 1938 sent a shockwave through the scientific community. They understood the terrifying potential, a chain reaction of unimaginable power. With the rise of Nazi Germany, a fear took hold that Adolf Hitler's scientists might be the first to weaponize this knowledge. This fear prompted one of the most famous warnings in history, a letter from Albert Einstein to President Franklin D. Roosevelt, urging the United States to begin its own atomic program. Thus, the Manhattan Project was born. It was a secret city of genius and industry, a universe contained within the deserts of New Mexico, led by the enigmatic J. Robert Oppenheimer. Here, the greatest minds of a generation, many of them refugees from fascist persecution, wrestled with a monumental task, their work shrouded in absolute secrecy. On July 16, 1945, at a test site codenamed Trinity, they succeeded. The first atomic bomb detonated, lighting up the pre-dawn sky with a light brighter than many suns. As he witnessed the fireball, Oppenheimer would later recall a line from Hindu scripture. "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." The weapon had been created, the genie was out of the bottle. The question now was not if it would be used, but when, and against whom. The war in Europe had ended with Hitler's defeat in May 1945. But in the Pacific, the war against Japan raged on with unrelenting ferocity. The battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa had demonstrated the Japanese military's willingness to fight to the last man, inflicting horrific casualties on American forces. The planned invasion of the Japanese home islands, Operation Downfall, was projected to cost millions of lives, both Allied and Japanese. For the new American president, Harry S. Truman, who had only learned of the Manhattan Project upon Roosevelt's death, the atomic bomb presented itself as a weapon that could end the war swiftly and avoid that catastrophic invasion. The weighing decision was moral and final. On August 6, 1945, the B-29 bomber Enola Gay released its payload over the city of Hiroshima. The bomb, nicknamed Little Boy, detonated 1,900 feet above the city. The result was instant, indiscriminate obliteration. A fireball incinerated everything at its core. A blast wave traveling at the speed of sound flattened buildings for miles. People at the immediate hypocenter were vaporized, leaving only ghostly shadows on the ground. Then came the radiation, a silent, poisoning sickness that would claim thousands more in the days, weeks, and years to come. The initial death toll was approximately 70,000 people, with tens of thousands more succumbing later. When Japan did not immediately surrender, a second bomb, Fat Man, was dropped on Nagasaki on August 9th, killing another 40,000 instantly. The world had witnessed a new, industrial-scale form of death. The Soviet Union declared war on Japan and invaded Manchuria. Faced with this overwhelming pressure, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945. The Second World War was over, but a new, even more dangerous conflict had already begun.
The United States, possessing a monopoly on atomic weapons, initially believed this would deter Soviet aggression, but that monopoly was short-lived. Thanks to a dedicated Soviet espionage effort that had penetrated the Manhattan Project, Soviet scientists led by Igor Kurchatov were able to accelerate their own program. In 1949, they successfully tested their first atomic bomb, named First Lightning. The American nuclear monopoly was broken. The arms race had begun in earnest. This was no longer a conventional conflict. It was a Cold War, a global standoff between two superpowers who now possessed the means to annihilate each other and, in doing so, make the entire planet uninhabitable. The doctrine of mutually assured destruction, or MAD, was becoming the grim, unstated logic of this new age. The atomic bomb, for all its horror, was soon seen as merely a first step. The next leap in destructive power was the hydrogen bomb, or thermonuclear weapon. Where atomic bombs used fission, splitting atoms, the H-bomb used fusion, the same process that powers the sun. The theoretical yield was virtually limitless. A fierce debate erupted among scientists. Opponents like J. Robert Oppenheimer and Enrico Fermi argued that such a weapon was genocidal, its use indefensible. Proponents, led by physicist Edward Teller, argued it was a necessary deterrent, that the United States could not afford to let the Soviets get there first. President Truman, fearing a Soviet advantage, greenlit the project. On November 1, 1952, the United States detonated Ivy Mike in the Pacific. It was not so much a bomb as a building-sized device. When it exploded, it vaporized the entire island of Elugilab, leaving a crater over a mile wide. The fireball was 3 miles across. The yield was 10.4 megatons, over 450 times more powerful than the bomb dropped on Nagasaki. Less than a year later, the Soviets tested their own deliverable hydrogen bomb. The stakes of the Cold War had been raised to an almost incomprehensible level. A single bomber carrying one of these weapons could now wipe out an entire city and poison the land for generations. The world now lived under the shadow of 1,000 suns, all waiting to be born in fire. The Cold War was a global game of chess, and by the late 1950s, the focal point was the island of Cuba, just 90 miles from the coast of Florida. In 1959, Fidel Castro's communist revolution overthrew the US-backed Batista regime. The United States, under President Eisenhower and then the young John F. Kennedy, viewed a communist satellite in America's backyard as an intolerable threat. A CIA-backed invasion of Cuban exiles at the Bay of Pigs in 1961 was a humiliating failure, solidifying Castro's alignment with the Soviet Union and his fear of an American invasion. For the Soviet premier, Nikita Khrushchev, Cuba presented a strategic opportunity. The United States had placed intermediate-range nuclear missiles in Turkey and Italy, directly threatening the Soviet hotland. The Soviet Union, however, lacked a comparable base near the American mainland. Placing nuclear missiles in Cuba would instantly rectify this perceived missile gap, giving the Soviets a powerful bargaining chip and a deterrent against American aggression. In the summer of 1962, under a cloak of utmost secrecy, the Soviet Union began Operation Anadyr, the clandestine shipment and construction of medium-range and intermediate-range ballistic missile sites in Cuba. It was a gamble of breathtaking audacity, one that would bring the world closer to the nuclear abyss than it had ever been. The crisis began on October 14, 1962, when a U-2 spy plane flying high over Cuba brought back clear photographic evidence of Soviet missile sites under construction. These were not defensive weapons. They were offensive nuclear missiles capable of striking Washington, D.C., New York, and most major American cities with virtually no warning. For President Kennedy and his team of advisors, the XCOM, the discovery was a profound shock. The deception, the brazen nature of the threat, demanded a response. The initial impulse from his military advisors like General Curtis LeMay was for a massive airstrike to destroy the sites, followed by a full-scale invasion of Cuba. Kennedy understood the terrifying logic of such an action. An airstrike could not guarantee the destruction of all missiles, and it would almost certainly kill the Soviet soldiers manning them. This would be an act of war, likely provoking a Soviet military response, perhaps against the US missiles in Turkey, or worse, against the American homeland. The path of airstrikes and invasion was a direct, rapid escalator to global thermonuclear war. Kennedy chose a different, more cautious, but still incredibly dangerous course: a naval quarantine, a blockade of Cuba to prevent further Soviet shipments of military equipment. On October 22nd, he addressed the nation in a televised broadcast, revealing the existence of the missiles to the world and declaring the quarantine. The world watched, paralyzed with fear. For days, Soviet ships steamed towards the quarantine line while American warships waited. The standoff was absolute.
Then, on October 27th, the crisis reached its absolute peak, a day that would later be known as Black Saturday. As the superpowers stared each other down on the world stage, the most dangerous moment of the crisis was unfolding unseen, deep beneath the waves of the Atlantic. The Soviet submarine B-59 was on patrol near Cuba when it was detected by American destroyers. The U.S. Navy, unaware the sub was carrying a nuclear-tipped torpedo, began dropping practice depth charges, small explosive charges intended to force the submarine to surface and identify itself. Inside B-59, the conditions were hellish. The cooling system had failed, temperatures soared to over 120 degrees Fahrenheit, carbon dioxide levels were rising, and the crew was suffering from heat exhaustion and lack of oxygen. The captain, Valentin Savitsky, had lost contact with Moscow. With depth charges exploding around his vessel, he had no way of knowing if war had already begun. In a state of extreme stress and fury, he concluded that the Third World War had broken out. He shouted to his crew that they were going to blast the American warships out of the water. To launch the nuclear torpedo, he needed the authorization of the flotilla commander, Vasily Arkhipov, and the political officer. The political officer agreed with Savitsky. The fate of millions rested on the next vote. Arkhipov, a calm and level-headed officer who had previously experienced a nuclear reactor accident on another submarine, dissented. He argued for calm, convinced the Americans were signaling, not attacking. He managed to persuade the enraged Savitsky to surface and await orders from Moscow. In that sweltering, claustrophobic tube, surrounded by the sounds of what he believed was an ongoing attack, Vasily Arkhipov's single vote, his refusal to authorize the launch, prevented a nuclear exchange. One torpedo, fired in confusion, would have likely triggered a massive American retaliation, followed by a full-scale Soviet launch. The decision that almost destroyed the planet was in the end averted by one man's composure under unimaginable pressure. Above the waves, Black Saturday was also spiraling towards catastrophe. A U-2 spy plane was shot down in Cuba, killing the pilot Major Rudolf Anderson. Another U-2 strayed into Soviet airspace over Siberia, nearly provoking a Soviet fighter intercept. In the White House, pressure for a military strike was mounting once again, but Kennedy, understanding that every escalation narrowed his options, resisted. He ignored the provocation of the downed U-2, focusing instead on a secret diplomatic channel that had opened with Khrushchev. Khrushchev had sent two conflicting messages, one emotional and conciliatory, offering to remove the missiles in exchange for a U.S. pledge not to invade Cuba. A second, more formal one, adding the demand for the removal of U.S. missiles in Turkey. Kennedy and his brother Robert, the Attorney General, devised a clever and risky solution. They publicly accepted the terms of the first letter, offering a non-invasion pledge for Cuba. Secretly, Robert Kennedy assured the Soviet ambassador that the Jupiter missiles in Turkey would be dismantled, but that this could not be part of a public deal as it would look like the U.S. was capitulating to Soviet blackmail. It was a face-saving measure for both sides. Khrushchev, who was also desperately seeking a way out of the crisis he had created, accepted the deal. On October 28th, he announced the dismantling of the Soviet missile sites in Cuba. The immediate crisis was over. The world exhaled. The planet had, by the narrowest of margins, been pulled back from the brink. The Cold War left an indelible mark on the world and its leaders. A direct telephone hotline was established between Washington and Moscow to prevent future dangerous miscalculations. The following year, the United States and Soviet Union signed the Limited Test Ban Treaty, outlawing nuclear tests in the atmosphere, a first step towards arms control. Both Kennedy and Khrushchev had stared into the nuclear abyss and been permanently changed by what they saw. They had learned that in the nuclear age, the classic tools of brinksmanship and escalation were obsolete, as they could lead to an outcome nobody could control. But the arms race did not end. It evolved, growing ever more complex and deadly with the proliferation of intercontinental ballistic missiles and multiple independently targetable warheads. The doctrine of mutually assured destruction became the grim, stabilizing principle of the Cold War for the next 30 years. The story of Vasily Arkhipov remained largely unknown for years, a testament to how the fate of the world can hinge on the unknown decisions of anonymous individuals. The crisis demonstrated that the machinery of war once set in motion can develop a momentum of its own, escaping the control of the very leaders who conceived it. Today, the nuclear arsenals remain. The weapons that were poised to destroy the world in 1962 are still with us, refined, more accurate, and in the hands of more nations than ever before. The decision that almost destroyed the planet was not a single event, but a pattern of behavior, a combination of ideological hostility, miscommunication, secret deployments, and the inherent risk of accidental war. The story of the Cold War missile is the ultimate cautionary tale. It teaches us that the margin between peace and annihilation can be as thin as one man's vote in a submerged steel tube. It reminds us that the technologies of ultimate destruction, once created, cannot be uninvented. They impose upon every generation that follows a solemn and ending responsibility: the vigilance to manage these instruments of doom, the wisdom to seek dialogue over confrontation, and the courage in moments of extreme crisis to choose the path of de-escalation. The planet was saved not by a triumph of arms, but by a last-minute triumph of reason over ritual, of human judgment over automated escalation. It is a lesson we forget at our perpetual and potentially final peril.